Marcus stopped sleeping in the bed roughly 3 weeks before his family called for help. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because he felt the mattress was wrong. Too soft, too human. He had begun sleeping on the floor of the back room, curled on his side, facing the wall. His wife described it later to clinicians as looking less like a man who had chosen the floor and more like a man who had forgotten he ever had a choice. By the time a psychiatric evaluation was arranged, Marcus had stopped using cutlery. He was eating with his hands, crouched low over the plate. When asked directly, by his brother, who had driven 4 hours to check on him, whether he knew what was happening, Marcus looked up and said with complete calm, "I can feel it changing, the bones, especially at night." He wasn't distressed when he said it. That was what frightened his brother most. He said it the way you would describe a weather forecast. Matter of fact, inevitable. Clinical lycanthropy is classified as a rare delusional syndrome in which an individual holds the fixed, unshakable belief that they are transforming, or have already transformed, into an animal. The term comes from the Greek lykos, meaning wolf, and anthropos, meaning human. While wolves are historically the most common animal reported, documented cases involve patients who believed they were becoming dogs, cats, birds, snakes, frogs, and even insects. The condition is not a metaphor. It is not a cultural performance. For those who experience it, the transformation is as real as any other physical process, felt in the body, perceived through the senses, and utterly resistant to contradiction. It is not the same as believing one has supernatural powers or identifying spiritually with an animal. This is a somatic delusion. The person believes their flesh, bones, and biology are changing. Psychiatric literature contains only a few hundred documented cases across recorded history, making clinical lycanthropy one of the rarest presentations in all of psychiatry. It rarely appears in isolation. Most cases occur alongside a primary psychiatric condition, most commonly bipolar disorder with psychotic features, schizophrenia, or severe depressive disorder with psychosis. In some cases, it has been associated with temporal lobe epilepsy, substance-induced psychosis, or neurological damage. The current understanding is that the condition emerges from a convergence of factors, a disruption in the brain's body schema, the internal map the mind uses to represent its own physical form, combined with psychotic thought architecture that assigns a specific animal identity to that disrupted map. The result is not confusion, it is certainty. Marcus's case is a composite drawn from multiple clinical records. His story does not belong to one man, but it is true to the experience that those records describe. Before any of this, Marcus was 34 years old and worked as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in the Pacific Northwest. He had a reputation among colleagues for being methodical, someone who read specifications twice, who noticed errors that others missed, who stayed late not because he was told to, but because an unresolved problem bothered him until it was resolved. His wife, Diane, described him as someone who expressed affection through doing. He fixed things. He showed up early. He remembered the names of her coworkers and asked after them. They had been together for 9 years. They had a daughter who was 6. By most external accounts, Marcus was stable. Perhaps rigidly so, but stable. He ran trails on the weekends. He had a small but consistent social circle. He read history books. He liked dogs, which would later feel, to those who knew him, like a strange and uncomfortable detail. The months before his first psychotic break had contained stressors, but not extraordinary ones. His firm had restructured. He had taken on a second team's workload. His sleep had become irregular. His mother had died 18 months earlier after a prolonged illness, a loss he had, by his own account, handled. He had not sought therapy. He had not taken time off. He had attended the funeral, returned to work the following week, and said, when asked how he was doing, that he was managing, which was true for a while. The first thing Diane noticed was the way he started moving, not dramatically, nothing that would register as alarming on its own, but a kind of deliberateness had crept into how he carried himself. He would pause in doorways. He would turn his head to sounds before he turned his body. Small things things you would dismiss as fatigue or distraction if you weren't looking closely. He also became sensitive to smell in a way that became difficult to ignore. He started commenting on odors that she couldn't detect, from the neighbors, from the refrigerator, from visitors who had left the house hours before. He once asked her whether she had changed her shampoo. She hadn't. He said he could tell something was different. He seemed unsettled by his own perception. In the 4th week, he mentioned it for the first time. He came in from a run, and instead of showering immediately, he stood in the hallway for a long moment. When she asked what was wrong, he said, "I keep dreaming that I'm running differently." She asked what he meant by differently. He struggled with the word for a moment, then said, "Lower." He laughed after he said it, as if he recognized how strange it sounded. She laughed too. 2 weeks later, the laughter had stopped. He was now describing physical sensations, pressure along his spine, what he called a tightness in his jaw, a feeling that his hands were not sitting correctly on his wrists. He had looked things up online. He didn't tell her what he'd found, but she noticed his search history was not medical in any conventional sense. He had been searching for accounts of werewolves, not movies, not mythology. Forum posts, personal testimonials, the accounts of people who believed it had happened to them. By the time Marcus had been not sleeping in the back room for 2 weeks, the delusional architecture of his belief had become elaborate and internally consistent. He had decided he was a wolf, not metaphorically, not in some spiritual sense. He believed that his skeletal structure was undergoing a gradual change, that the change accelerated during the night, and that the life he had been living, the job, the family, the house, were increasingly foreign to him, in the way that a set of clothes becomes foreign when worn by the wrong body. He did not frame this as frightening, he framed it as clarifying. This is one of the most striking features of clinical lycanthropy as recorded in case literature. In a significant number of cases, the delusion is not experienced as a horror, it is experienced as a revelation. Marcus had not become violent, he had become distant. He withdrew from physical contact with his daughter. He explained to Diane in a conversation she would later describe to his treatment team in detail that it was not because he didn't love her, but because he was aware that his nature was changing and he didn't want to confuse her about what he was. He stopped speaking at the dinner table. He began vocalizing sounds that were not words under his breath when he thought no one was listening. His daughter heard him once through the door of the back room. She came to her mother and said very quietly that Daddy was growling. When Diane called her own sister for advice, she said she didn't know how to explain what was happening because there was no category for it. She said, "He's not angry, he's not sad. He seems fine, he just doesn't seem like himself anymore. He seems like something else." Marcus was eventually admitted for psychiatric evaluation following an incident in the yard at 3 a.m, observed by a neighbor, in which he was found on all fours on the lawn in a posture that the neighbor, in their statement, described as if he were hunting. Marcus had not acknowledged the neighbor. He had not responded to his name when called. He had returned inside on his own roughly 15 minutes later and gone back to the floor of the back room. The following morning, he ate breakfast normally and asked Diane what time the neighbor's daughter had a recital. He had not forgotten, but he was also not the same. What was happening inside Marcus's mind during these weeks is not entirely understood, because clinical lycanthropy itself is not entirely understood, but the neuroscience offers a framework. The brain maintains what researchers call a body schema, a continuous, mostly unconscious model of the body's shape, position, and boundaries. This model is generated by integrating signals from the proprioceptive system, the vestibular system, and the somatosensory cortex. When those signals become disrupted through psychosis, neurological damage, extreme sleep deprivation, or other means, the brain's representation of the body can become unstable. In ordinary circumstances, that instability produces depersonalization, or a vague sense that the body doesn't feel quite right. But in an individual already operating within a psychotic framework, a framework where the normal constraints on belief have been loosened, that instability becomes raw material. The brain, unable to reconcile the disrupted body signals with a coherent human identity, generates an alternative explanation. In Marcus's case, and in the cases this composite draws from, the brain settled on an animal identity. The choice of wolf is not arbitrary. Neurological and anthropological researchers have noted that culturally salient animal identities, those with symbolic weight in the individual's cultural background, appear more frequently than random ones. The wolf, in Western cultural tradition, carries specific freight: wildness, predation, the boundary between civilization and its absence. The delusion, in a sense, borrows its shape from the available symbolic vocabulary. What makes this especially difficult to treat is what clinicians call the ego-syntonic quality of the belief in many cases. Unlike delusions that produce terror or paranoia, the lycanthropic delusion in Marcus's profile was not experienced as intrusive. It felt true. It felt like self-knowledge, and a person who believes they have finally understood what they are does not, by default, want to be corrected. Marcus was hospitalized for 41 days. His treatment team identified an underlying bipolar I disorder with psychotic features, a diagnosis that had gone undetected across his entire adult life, in part because his presentation had always skewed toward controlled, high-functioning depressive episodes rather than obvious mania, and in part because he had never sought evaluation. The lycanthropic delusion responded slowly to antipsychotic medication, not immediately, not cleanly. The initial weeks of treatment saw Marcus oscillate between moments of apparent clarity and full re-immersion in the belief. In one session, he reportedly described the medication as something that made the wolf quiet, which his treatment team noted was not the same as no longer believing in the wolf. Full resolution of the primary delusion took several months of combined pharmacological and psychotherapeutic intervention. By the end of that period, Marcus described the experience not as a delusion. He resisted that word for a long time, but as something that had happened to his thinking. He and Diane did not separate, though their relationship required extensive work. His daughter was told, in age-appropriate terms, that her father had been very unwell and was getting better. Marcus returned to work approximately 14 months after his initial hospitalization, in a reduced capacity at first. He continued outpatient psychiatric care. He told his therapist in one of their later sessions that the strangest part of the whole experience, stranger than the beliefs themselves, was how real the sensations had been. He said, "I don't know how to explain to someone that I felt my body changing. Not that I thought it was, that I felt it." His therapist noted this in the session record without comment. It is a distinction that psychiatric language does not yet have a fully satisfying way to address. Clinical lycanthropy is disturbing, not because it is violent, and not because it is incomprehensible. It is disturbing because it is coherent. Because the mind, given the right set of pressures, grief, sleep loss, a neurological system beginning to fracture along lines that were always there, can construct an identity so complete and so physical that the person inside it is not lost. They are found. They believe, with the full weight of their sensation and perception, that they have finally understood what they are. That is not a failure of reason. It is reason operating in a broken context, arriving at a conclusion that no amount of external argument can easily undo. The question it leaves behind is a quiet one. If the brain can dissolve the boundary between human and animal with such thoroughness, not as metaphor, not as madness in the screaming sense, but as calm, embodied certainty, then what exactly is it that makes us certain we are what we think we are? If you like unsettling psychology, like and subscribe for a new diagnosis each week.